Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times with me, Adrian Goldberg. This recording at the Byline Festival at Keele University in Staffordshire. My guest this time is former MI6 officer turned whistleblower Chris Steele, who runs Orbis, a business intelligence agency based in London. Chris's seminal 2016 dossier alleged that Russia was seeking to interfere in the US election, the election which saw Donald Trump elected for the first time. It also claimed that the Kremlin held compromising material on Trump. Chris Steele's book, Unredacted, published in 2024, warned that the incoming president represented, and I quote, the gravest threat to democracy. That warning was ignored by the US electorate, and we are all around the world feeling the consequences of that. Chris Steele, welcome to the Byline podcast. For a man of your background, that is a really stark and strong warning to make about an incoming US president. What was it based on?
I think it's fundamentally based on the fact that I don't believe Trump either believes in the rule of law or democracy. You know, it's not good enough to only accept the results of elections when you win, and it's not good enough to accept the results of court cases when you win and not when you lose. And I think it's very clear that in both those fundamental instances, Trump is not a Democrat.
There are people who would argue that from a political point of view, political opponents of Trump, perhaps even some former political supporters of Trump. But yours is based on, partly anyway, your experience gathering intelligence on him. Just tell me how that intelligence came about, that intelligence gathering came about, and what it led you to understand about how Trump operates.
Yeah, I would say actually it's both intelligence gathering and then subsequent experience of fighting lawsuits against Trump, or him fighting lawsuits against us. But going back to the intelligence, it came about fundamentally because we had been obviously working on Russia for many years. It was my area of professional specialty. And we had produced a report in late 2015, early 2016 on Russian interference operations in the politics of Europe, which was called Charlemagne for a commercial client in the UK. And our US associates in the company there that hired us eventually, Fusion GPS, knew about that project because they had helped on it. And when they got a contract from initially people supporting, I think, Marco Rubio in the primaries in America in 2015-16, and then subsequently from the Democratic campaign itself, we were an obvious place to go for a hire because they knew that we already had been working on this issue, had sources capable of reporting on it, and actually had IP already stacked up.
And what did that dossier that you put together find? Your Steele dossier.
Sure. I mean, it's a bit of a misnomer, obviously, but it wasn't just me that wrote it or produced it or whatever. But I think what we had was a well-established network of sources in and on Russia. And when we went in and tested the water on this, we found some pretty shocking results. And we found there was a whole-scale Russian campaign to interfere in the US election, that it was basically designed to damage Hillary Clinton and to benefit Donald Trump, and that there were elements of collusion, as we would call it, although it's not a legal term, it's a political or intelligence term, between the Trump campaign and Russia, notably in the form of Paul Manafort in particular, who was the pro-Russian campaign manager who Donald Trump very strangely and suddenly hired as campaign manager in 2016 for no apparent reason.
And Paul Manafort, for people who don't know, had also been an advisor to Viktor Yanukovych, who was the pro-Russian president of Ukraine at the time of the Euromaidan protests.
Indeed, and was in league with a guy called Konstantin Kilimnik, who was, according to the Senate Intelligence Committee, no less, a Russian agent.
You believe that the collusion ultimately led to the US election in 2016 being swung in the favour of Donald Trump. Just explain that, unpack that idea.
Yes, there's a lot of work gone into this. It's not just intelligence, it's psephology, it's opinion polling and so on. But what it looks like is that if you remember, it all revolved around, because Trump lost the popular vote, it all revolved around 3 states, really, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin and Michigan, where the margins of victory were in the area of 0.1% to 0.2%, so 10, 20,000 votes. And it's very conceivable that an influence operation on the scale that the Russians had launched it would lead to enough of a swing to decide the outcome. And as I was saying upstairs in the presentation that I just given the panel, it was clear what the Russians were actually doing was trying to dissuade black voters in those states from turning out for Hillary Clinton, as they had previously turned out for Barack Obama in the 2 elections that preceded that. And the argument was, that Hillary Clinton's a member of the white elite, that she's not pro-black rights, etc., etc. Barack Obama doesn't like her, which we can debate, but which certainly there seemed to be some evidence for, as they'd been rivals in the previous primaries. And that was enough to persuade several tens of thousands of black voters in those states not to turn out to vote, which made the difference.
And in those states, then, the electoral colleges cast their votes in favour of Trump. So although he lost the popular vote, it swung the vote through the electoral colleges and therefore swung it in Trump's favour. What is the line, though, from Trump through Paul Manafort to the operation which then seeks to influence black voters to stay at home and not cast their vote at all? Just talk that through for people who don't understand that line.
Well, I think going back again, it's not particularly intelligence related, but I think in terms of the polling operations that were going on at the time, and of course, the infamous Cambridge Analytica were involved in that. I think that the Republican side, the Trump side, had far more sophisticated polling techniques going on, and the Democrat campaign had assumed that they would win those 3 states and poured almost no resource into it. And Hillary Clinton didn't visit those states in the final weeks of the election, and Trump did. And I think the reason Trump did is he saw the polling and may also have been aware of the Russian influence operation.
And there was evidence of...
Excuse me.
And at the same time, there was a Russian-based influencer operation through social media orchestrated by a guy called Prigozhin.
Yeah, I think it was...
troll farms. Really.
There were troll farms going on, but there were also other things happening. There was probably exchanges of campaign data. There was the meeting, if you remember, in Trump Tower. There were various things happening. There was also this Russian agent, Maria Butina, if you remember her, the sort of ginger-haired one, who was operating in and around Republican leadership circles at the time. There was the change of the platform at the Republican convention, which moved away from supplying Ukraine with lethal weaponry. So there were various things happening at the time that looked as though they were being influenced from Moscow.
And you think then it is credible that the Russian interference operation swung the 2016 election in Trump's favour?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, the Mueller report in the United States investigated Russian influence, and one of the key areas that Mueller investigated was that of collusion. And in the presentation that you've given here at the Byline Festival, you've been keen to emphasise that although Mueller did not find evidence of collusion in a strictly narrow legal sense...
Conspiracy in a legal sense. So Mueller was a lawyer. His investigation was a legal special counsel's investigation. It was designed to create prosecutorial outcomes. And as we've been saying today, you know, the rules and regulations surrounding cooperation with foreign powers, hostile foreign powers, has been very unclear and very unregulated in Western democracies over the last 10 or 20 years, where we've become complacent. And I think there was powerful evidence actually of collusion in there. I mean, it talks about the Paul Manafort situation. There was also the Carter Page visits to Moscow and secret talks with Russian leadership figures.
Again, for people who don't know that.
Yeah, Carter Page was a foreign policy advisor on the Trump campaign who was pro-Russian and had a history of doing business there. And he certainly visited Moscow a couple of times in the run-up to the election and had meetings with senior people in the government.
And we have to talk about it, I think, if we're going to tell the whole story. The dossier did make allegations about the famous PP tape as well, the Compromat, the compromising information that Russia holds on Donald Trump, or is said to hold on Donald Trump. Trump, of course, denies it. In your view, based on your career in intelligence, is that a persuasive argument that there is Compromat on Trump?
Yeah, and I think it's likely that there is Compromat on Trump. Trump visited Russia many times over that period as a businessman, and you can see by his general attitude and conduct over the years that he would be vulnerable and susceptible to this kind of approach. So I don't think there's anything surprising about it. In a way, it would be more surprising if the Russians hadn't tried to compromat Trump. Now the question is, what have they got? I think it's probably both financial information. I think there were a lot of Russian investments in his real estate, but also probably behavioural as well. But at the moment, we don't know, because these things, if they exist, will be well and truly locked down in the Kremlin.
Around the same time, and you've already mentioned that you were investigating Russian influence in Europe as well, around the same time that Trump is elected for the first time, we have the EU referendum here. I think perhaps at that time, if you'd said to people that the Russians are seeking to influence the outcome of the EU referendum, most people would have regarded that as far-fetched in the UK. Do you not think? At the time?
Possibly. No, I actually think the Russians had initially looked at this in terms of the UK. When the Scottish independence referendum took place in 2014, there were some signs even then that they were probing at the system and whether they could influence it, because they wanted to weaken the UK by creating Scottish separatism. So when it came to 2016, I think there was a debate in the Kremlin. Our sources tell us that it wasn't a straightforward linear decision. One of the counter-arguments was that, if Britain left the EU, Germany would become the dominant power on the European continent, and that's something, clearly for historical reasons, the Russians fear. But ultimately, I think there was definitely a view before the referendum that the Russians wanted to support Brexit, and indeed afterwards were very active in trying to make sure that Brexit was both implemented and was as divisive as possible in the UK in our political system, which of course it was.
And the reasons for that being perhaps twofold then: one, to weaken the European Union, but also simply to sow dissent in this country.
Oh yes, you remember how divisive an issue it was, splitting families and so on. So it doesn't surprise me at all. And one of the things I've been emphasising today actually is that although Britain is not the most powerful country in Europe in terms of its economy or whatever, or the largest, it's the one that Russia is focused upon as its key adversary.
What is the reason for that? We are still a significant military power, but
we're
not that significant a military power.
Well, we are quite in ultimate terms, of course, we have our own independent deterrent, but I think it runs wider than that. I think, Britain was historically an internationally leaning country with trade and international empire and everything, and we encountered the Russians in, I've read the Great Game in Central Asia and in other places. And I think there's a sense that Britain has been more successful in getting under the skin of Russia, of understanding the dark side of Russia and what Russian intent really is. And we had a case earlier, there was a description of the Gordievsky case in the 1980s, where we were running as one of our agents the senior KGB officer in London, who was giving us incredible insights into even the Gorbachev years, where, you had this guy who you thought was a cuddly reformer, and actually what was happening under his rule was, a secret biological weapons program, that officers accused of working for the West were summarily executed, and things like that. So I suspect that the Russians know that British intelligence and British diplomacy is wiser and more savvy about what they get up to in reality than other countries, and probably is the sort of ringleader in trying to persuade countries like Germany and France and Italy, Spain and others as to exactly what Russia's about and why it's a threat.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it primarily ideological, that the UK sees itself in terms of its belief in freedom and democracy as ideologically posed to the new imperialism of Russia? Is it that we're just willing to put our head above the parapet and call it out?
British foreign policy traditionally was that there should be no single dominant power in Europe and that we shouldn't be dragged into European conflicts. And of course, that didn't quite work out very well in the First World War in particular. But I think that, I think Britain still has, despite everything, more influence and clout in the world, especially the world beyond Europe, than any other country in Europe does. And I think that's significant.
I know there have been legal cases fought on this, so you and I will both be very careful, I'm sure, with our language. But do you believe that Russian influence was at play in the 2016 EU referendum?
Yes, I do, in the sense that we have intelligence that points in that direction. And I think there are some other signifiers there as well. If you look at certainly the conduct of Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary and then Prime Minister is not something that you would hold up to a candle. I mean, he was shimmering off to wild parties in Italy without any bodyguards or any officials and having meetings with Russians and so on over a very sensitive period. And in many ways, the media, the fact that Russians were allowed to own sections of the British media around that time is all pointing in one direction, that we were lackadaisical at best and complicit at worst in Russian influence operations in the UK over that period.
But you're less certain that it swung the referendum towards Brexit?
Yeah, I think that, it wasn't a result that hinged on 30,000 votes or 0.1%. Of a percentage point, 0.10% of a percentage point. And so I don't think you can say, it's very difficult to quantify it anyway, but I think it may have influenced, but I think actually the sort of baleful influence of Russia on us was in the period after Brexit, where Britain became almost ungovernable and inward-looking and divided in the period when Theresa May was Prime Minister. I think the Russians were very active as well in our politics over that time.
And they'll have been revelling in that chaos.
Well, you heard the quote that was given. Alexander Yakovenko, who was the ambassador at the time, went back to Moscow in 2019 and said, Britain is on its knees and will not rise up for many years.
I mentioned earlier that I think if you'd said to most people anyway in Britain in 2016, at the time of the EU referendum, that Russia was seeking to interfere in British elections, I think most people would have regarded that as a little bit fantastical. I would suggest that most informed people certainly wouldn't have that view now. Has that influence stopped now that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine has brought British resistance, support for Ukraine, brought clear sanctions against Russian oligarchs and so on?
Yeah, I think it's more difficult for the apologists for Russia and the agents of influence of Russia to be active in the public square because of the war and because of the state of relations with Putin and the assessment of Putin as a key ally of, Iran and North Korea and other places. But I think it still goes on. I mean, Russia has arguably more interests today in trying to influence and disrupt British politics than it did even in 2016. After all, it's fighting a war which, it may not be an existential war for Russia, but it could be an existential war for the regime and Putin in particular. So stakes are very high, and Britain is the strongest supporter of Ukraine outside of Eastern Europe. And now with America effectively neutralised under Trump in this regard, Britain's the main target, I think, for Russian interference. And the aims of it will be slightly different. Obviously, it'll be focused upon military assistance to Ukraine and political support for Ukraine and Britain's efforts to make a united front in Europe on Ukraine. But ultimately, it's the same objective, which is to further Russia's interests, which are inimical to democracy and freedom.
I'll come to the current situation in the United States in a moment. I just want to talk here, though, about the UK, and former senior intelligence officials have suggested that in reality we are at war now with Russia, or Russia is at war with us.
Yeah.
Do you think that is an accurate description?
Well, I certainly think the Russians think they are. I mean, we were talking about this upstairs, that hybrid warfare is very difficult to define. What actually constitutes an act of war and what doesn't. Does assassinating a Russian dissident on the street constitute an act of war? does cutting a fibre optic cable that carries our communications. Is that an act of war? Is blowing up an aircraft over our territory an act of war? So you can see where the kind of grey lines are. And of course, the Russians thrive in that area because in a democracy, you can't just have policy made up on the hoof according to what you think rather than what the people think. It's got to be drawn out through democracy and through consensus. And there's not a consensus in this country that we're at war with Russia. And I don't mind the fact that the political elite might try and play this down and sort of not inflame it. But what I worry about is that isn't just a front, that behind the scenes they're making excuses for not doing certain things as well, like rearming, like looking at European pillar of security rather than over-reliance on the US, real sanctions, what they would comprise of against the Russian oil industry that still haven't been implemented. I mean, the Russians have had more revenue from EU countries for oil and gas exports since the war started in 2022 than they've given in aid to Ukraine. And I think people need to think about that.
Well, that's an astonishing statistic. And this brings us on to the United States then. When it comes to combating Russia, can we rely as the UK on the United States as a reliable ally?
Not at the moment. Very interesting. Again, I was saying upstairs that ex-CIA, ex-NSA, ex-FBI, State Department officials who I speak to on a regular basis are sounding the alarm bells. I mean, basically the structures in American security architecture and the FBI and the Department of Justice in particular that deal with foreign agents, foreign interference, kleptocracy, foreign corruption, have been frozen or dismantled under this government in the last 6 months. I don't think they can be trusted, from my experience, for keeping the identities of sources secret or out of the public domain. I certainly would not trust the American government or the American services with any intelligence at the moment in any form.
Wow. So do you,
particularly on Russia?
Yeah. It's your view then that British intelligence should not be sharing some confidential data, particularly as it pertains to Russia, with our traditional closest ally, the United States.
Yeah, and I think that's probably what's happening, although they won't be making any fuss or noise about it.
You think they will be withholding information?
Well, there's always, particularly less so on technical intelligence, where we're kind of hardwired into the same system, but on human intelligence, which is my area, there was always an element of judgment and assessment went on before sharing happened. And I think that's got to be very carefully looked at. I mean, the Americans, as currently constituted under Trump, with Ratcliffe and as head of the CIA and Patel as head of the FBI, have proven that they are prepared to give out the names of Russian agents willy-nilly in order to make a political point or gain a political advantage. And that is absolute anathema. And even in the public domain now, on X, people like Mark Polymeropoulos, who's a former senior CIA officer, and saying, don't share with us, we're dismantling our security state.
You said the United States has now been neutralised. I'd just be interested to get your overview of its stance on Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia, because there's been a bit of a hokey-cokey, a bit of an in and out in terms of arming Ukraine.
Yeah.
Can they continue to avoid giving proper support to Ukraine? Will they continue?
I think it's very interesting. I think what's happened here is that Trump's inclinations are towards Putin and towards Russia and towards kind of trying to sort of put Ukraine on one side and move forward and reset the relationship with Russia, probably is with a view to business advantage, arguably corrupt business advantages flowing from that.
Whilst claiming the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, Nobel Peace Prize for bombing other countries, yeah. And being nominated by Netanyahu, who's an indicted war criminal. Anyway, we do laugh, but this is actually quite serious stuff. But I think coming back to that, in terms of the US's policy towards Ukraine, I think what's happened is that Putin internally is either unwilling or unable to give the sort of concessions which we might regard as minor, like, for example, turning up and meeting Zelensky and shaking his hand, or agreeing a 30-day total ceasefire, which you would think that he would do in order to move forward his interests and those of Donald Trump. He seems unable to do that, probably because of internal pressure, that Russia's sacrificed so much in this war that there are red lines that he can't cross. And one of those is leaving Zelensky in power. One of those is leaving, the Ukrainian state in operation as it has been, free to choose its own leadership, free to pursue its foreign policies and things like that, and to trade. And because Putin can't give those sort of assurances to Trump, Trump's in a corner, and he cannot justify to the broader, even Republican Party in America, a policy which is pro-Russian. And so I think Putin's mishandled Trump since he came back. I think Trump was his one hope for getting out of this quagmire in reasonable shape, and he's blown it.
But will the United States then continue this kind of half in, half out policy in regards to Ukraine, whereby it says that it supports Ukraine's right to defend itself, but doesn't give it the means by which it can seriously defend itself and push Russia back?
Yeah, I suspect there's all sorts of things going on behind the scenes that people hope Trump doesn't see or know about in terms of what's being provided, because the American security establishment, of course, is firmly behind Ukraine, as you would expect, but they have these cranky, crazy guys who are running the Department of Defense and the FBI and even the presidency that they have to work around, and that's yet to play out. So I think we will see these kind of ebbing and flowing of American rhetoric, and particularly of American support for Ukraine. It's very clear that they've not been providing even the military equipment that was voted for and agreed on under the Biden administration, which they certainly should have done, regardless of there being a new presidency. So I still think it's very worrying, and I think that, as I say, I'd hoped that Putin would overplay his hand with Trump because I knew what a serious situation we were in, and I think Putin is overplaying his hand with Trump.
Trump is also coming under pressure from his own base in relation to the Epstein files. And Elon Musk has been driving a lot of that. But a lot of MAGA supporters are saying, OK, then let's see the Epstein files. Trump himself has posted on social media.
Which, incidentally, I think the Russians have. It's very interesting. Yeah.
They have the Epstein
files.
Well,
I think they do, because there was a guy called, I think, Mark Dugan, who was a detective in Florida who was investigating Epstein back a few years ago in probably the teens, the 20-teens, who effectively defected to Russia, presumably with a whole load of exhibits from his investigation. So I think we have to assume that whatever is in the Epstein files the Russians have, and it seems from what people have said and the photographs you've seen, there was another photograph came out a couple of days ago of Trump with Epstein, that it's, again, highly likely that Trump features in those files.
Indeed. Well, Elon Musk has suggested that he does, hasn't he? And obviously they've fallen out now. So the MAGA base, or some of it anyway, is pushing for the release of the Epstein files. Trump is pushing back on that. And in fact, he's cited your dossier as an example of the kind of fake news that the Epstein files also, in his view, represent. He's saying that, these are the kinds of fake attack that are being launched on him. But of course, he hasn't published the Epstein files. He did say, didn't he, that his argument is that if the Democrats had the opportunity to publish the Epstein files and didn't, and had there been anything seriously damaging to MAGA, then the Democrats would have published it already.
Yeah, but I think there are probably certain Democrats that appear in the files as well. I think it's not unreasonable. It's not unreasonable to think that Bill Clinton might be in there, along with others. There was a Bill Richardson who was the Democrat. He was the governor of New Mexico, I think, and possibly a Democratic senator, I think, from Georgia, who was Mitchell, the guy involved in the Northern Ireland peace process. These are all names of senior Democrats that have been associated with Epstein in the files.
So, and let's just be clear, being named in the files does not make you a paedophile. It means that you were a contact that is very well connected.
But it's reputationally damaging.
Yeah.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
Anyone that's associated with Epstein in any shape or form is going to be suffering serious reputational damage. And it's arguable that the Democrats had as much interest in the files not coming out as the Republicans do.
Would you expect Trump to feature prominently in them?
I think it's highly likely, given what we've seen. I mean, the video coverage of them together, the photos of them together, what people are saying, I think it's inconceivable that Trump wouldn't feature in the files.
I mentioned your book, Unredacted, published in 2024 in the United States, not published in the UK. Why not?
I think two reasons, really. One is it does have more of a US focus than a UK focus, although there's obviously chapters in there in the UK. Secondly, because of the situation, the plaintiff-friendly civil laws that we have in this country, and particularly libel and data protection and other things, where the bias is in favour of the plaintiff. And even if the plaintiff doesn't really have a strong case, they can drag you through the courts and cost you a lot of money. I mean, Trump sued us under the Data Protection Act in 2022, a case that's now cost my company nearly £1 million, and which he lost at every stage and was struck out. He won't pay his costs order we've got against him. And so he's basically he's half strangled the company for 3 years for no reason of justice. And I think that, people are aware of that threat. And I think we have a dire need to educate people as to the limits to freedom of speech in Britain, that we need to look to the American First Amendment of their Constitution. We need to look at what's called a public figure status, whereby if you're deemed to be a public figure in America, it's very difficult to sue for libel. In order to remedy the situation. My friend Catherine Belton, as you are aware, when she wrote her classic book, Putin's People, faced 6 potential suits. And that's the reality of our civil legal system, and it needs to be changed. We need to have an anti-SLAPP law introduced in this country. There is a movement in that direction across party and parliament, I'm glad to say. But we need to get on with it as a priority. And we need to make sure the legal profession is not dining out on suppressing our rights of free speech.
Thanks for your time, Chris. Thank you. That is Chris Steele. The good news is that if you do want to read his book, Unredacted, you can get it via the internet. That's how easy it is these days. So I do recommend it. Unredacted by Christopher Steele. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been an episode of the Byline podcast, which you may also be watching on Byline TV, recorded at the Byline Festival at Keele University. And it's been produced by me and by Sean Byrne-Roberts. If you want to support our work at the Byline Times and get a fantastic monthly news publication dropping through your letterbox, or our wonderful digital version of it, do head over to our website, bylinetimes.com, where you get some fantastic articles and you'll be able to subscribe as well. And our print edition contains the best of our online articles and content that you can't read anywhere else. That's at bylinetimes.com. Thanks very much indeed for listening. You may be able to tell we've had a bit of background noise here. I hope that isn't interfered with your pleasure in any way. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye now.